All right, I can see a couple people still typing, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and jump in. So, like I said, let's go through an order, but I'm going to prioritize anything highlighted in yellow. So I'm going to go through those first, and then we'll go back up and kind of navigate the rest. Okay, so the first question, as I can see someone highlighting here, so I'll do this question first, actually, which is I'm in building your home. I'm starting out to create a brand for lifestyle pain and was wondering if a newsletter-based setup. Oh, a little hard to read out here. I'm gonna switch it to this yellow.
I'm so sorry about that.
No, you're all good. Just was struggling to read a bit, but and I was wondering if a newsletter-based setup would be the best format of engagement for my audience. So I like this question actually because the important thing to consider is that I think people forget that content comes in many different forms, and the form itself doesn't necessarily guarantee your success or actually drive your success in many cases. So, if you think about it, a lot of the same content could be written in a book or podcast or newsletter or, a daily newsletter versus a weekly newsletter or a blog or, like all of these are forms of content, a movie, right? And actually, let me pull up, I think I have in slides. So I'm just going to pull up one of the presentations. Actually, I'm trying to find the one on podcasting here. So I'm showing you this. It's not directly related to podcasting, but it's one of the key things that I covered in this section. So if you haven't seen it yet, you can see here, and there's even more than this, all of the different forms of content that exist, right? And the kind of choice of the type of content that you choose may influence your success. I mean, it almost certainly will influence it, but it will not determine your success, right? You can easily have a successful newsletter where if you were to take that same content and put it in a podcast, it could be successful as well. The thing that I would consider is not necessarily like which one is the best, because there is no like clear best in every single case. It's more so I'd answer two questions. One of them is like, which one can I do well? Right. So some people are naturally better writers than speakers. I find myself to be a better writer than a speaker, for example. So I've kind of gone with like what I can do best as a creator. But then also where does my audience hang out? Right. And I'm not as familiar with, lifestyle pain in particular as a topic, but I would just consider like, does my audience hang out in X place or Y place more often? And do I have channels to reach them easily for a podcast? Yes or no? Do I have channels to reach them easily for a newsletter? So those are the two questions I would ask myself in terms of the best format for engagement, right? Like, how am I able to reach these people? And then also, am I able to show up consistently to create this thing? Because if not, like, it doesn't matter if you think that podcasting is the best potential medium. If you're not a great podcaster or you don't want to podcast, then that doesn't really matter, right? So those are actually the two things that I would ask myself, because there's no like truly correct medium, if that makes sense, for any audience. I
Yeah,
wonder.
just to connect with that,
Sure.
I think what I'm understanding here is that it makes sense to understand the potential place where the audience is set up and then correspondingly pick the medium for that. Because we are starting off with a new brand right now, which is on lifestyle plane, and we really want to dive deep into content creation for it, so that like there is a space built up for the kind of issues that we're targeting, and like we're wondering what is the best segment or what are the best platforms for it. So yeah,
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think that is important.
Yeah, that's the way I would think about it, is like, where are people even thinking about like, a lot of people, for example, will, when they start a company, they'll say, okay, I need to create like all of these social channels and a blog and like maybe a newsletter. And they'll just like check boxes to say like, it's time to do X. And that's fine to a degree, but really what they should be asking is like, who are we trying to reach? And then where do they hang out? So for example, if the people you're trying to reach like don't hang out on Instagram, like why invest in creating Instagram? Why not just focus all in on Twitter, as an example, right? And maybe in some cases it's the opposite. But I think a lot of people go through, whether it's company or their personal entities, and they just check boxes. They say, okay, it's time to create a podcast, it's time to create a blog. And it's like, it's not time to do anything, right? It's time to sit down and think about where your audience is, where they hang out, and then how you can reach them most effectively. But then I also added in the other variable of just like, what can you do? And the same thing is true within a company. Like if you have people who are truly, great podcasters, but not great writers, like maybe don't create a newsletter or go hire someone who is a good writer to do that, right? So the skill set that you have within yourself or within your company is an important input to that as well, right? And again, like there are so many different versions of content or mediums for content that there is no correct one. It's about what you can do well, and then also what your audience, I guess, more naturally digests. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much.
Sure. All right.
I've just started reading doing content, right? So just on the second, third chapter here.
Awesome.
So, going good stuff. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for reading it. Awesome. I can see, let me just quickly check the chat because, oh yes. Sorry, Daniel. Yeah, feel free to add questions, and please, just as you're doing that, make sure they're in yellow so I can prioritize any of the live questions first. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down and talk about distribution, and this is quite a long question, but I'll try to read all of it. So
I can
oh, go for it. Yeah.
Sorry.
All good.
It's just mostly to jot down my thoughts.
Yeah.
Basically, I just got certified to teach mindfulness meditation. And so right now I'm building my website, my Squarespace website, to get a business set up and running so people can sign up. So in my list of priorities, like blogging and newsletter and podcasting is kind of like secondary to that. But I also realize how important that is, just to get a digital footprint out there. And so I was kind of torn as to whether I should set up my business on Ghost first, and sacrifice kind of the design and the ease of use for the SEO, for the web compatibility. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure what to do really, because I also know like the power of simplicity and design in Squarespace right now. For me, it's just easy to use. But I also know that you kind of rib on Squarespace a little bit for their SEO and stuff. So
yeah. I mean, I was going to start saying, great question. Also, congrats on being certified. That's awesome.
Oh, thank you.
So the thing that I would say, so I do rip on some platforms because I rip on them, but in a very particular lane, in the sense that I don't think you should use Squarespace or Wix or certain other platforms for blogging. But the difference is, so what I would actually recommend for you to do, and I do something similar with my own site, is that just for the blogging component. So actually, if you go to, there's stephsmith.io, but then there's also blog.stephsmith.io. So you can see they're on the same domain, because this is a subdomain, but they're completely different, right? So this one is built through Ghost, using like a Ghost theme and run on Ghost. This one is actually self-coded. You don't need to self-code it, but this is self-coded, run completely differently on different servers. And so what I would recommend for you to do is something very similar to that. So use each platform for what they're great at. So you absolutely, I think Squarespace is incredible for just like simple sites that are beautifully designed and just easy to compile. So do that for your like homepage or any like sales pages, for example, or any like contact pages. So use it for basically everything other than the like blogging component. Just I've used Squarespace for blogging and it's missing so many features, and it's not like it's not great for SEO. And so that's what I would do. You basically set up a subdomain for, you don't need to call it blog.fernando.io. You could call it like whatever you want, right? And tons of companies, this is like some people think that subdomains are like bad for SEO, but it's like it's completely fine. And that's been like, Google has even like come out and said that. So you don't need to worry about that side. So I would personally say set up a subdomain for your blog, use Ghost for that. Cause that's just the reason that I vouch for Ghost is because it's just so good at that one thing. Ghost is terrible at, if you were to set up like a landing page on Ghost, like that's not what it's made for, right? If you want to do any e-commerce like that, that's not even possible, right? So I would use Ghost. And you don't even need to use the DigitalOcean droplet. One of the nice things about when this book came out, Ghost was, I mean, it wasn't that expensive, but they only had the $30 a month plan. And so I was
Mhm.
kind of like, oh, like I'd rather do $5 on DigitalOcean because it was pretty easy to set up. But now they actually have the $9 option as well. So it's like even easier if you just want to like basically do no code to set up, again, like Ghost on your subdomain. And then for everything else, absolutely, I think Squarespace is an awesome tool, just not for blogging.
Okay, fantastic. So a couple questions arose from that. And that's good to know because I was a bit confused too if I needed to get DigitalOcean if I already had Ghost. So that's good to know. Do you cover how to set up a subdomain in the Doing Content Right course, or is that just something I could Google up?
It's not in the course, but I also, so I cover it in, what's it called? This is, I'll just pull it up here. So I have a tutorial on setting it up with a droplet. So you don't necessarily need to set it up with a droplet, but it goes over like how to set up your DNS settings, which is where you would be setting up the subdomain and the routing for that. So like in your DNS here, I use Cloudflare, but for example, your site itself would have specific DNS settings that like route to Squarespace for everything else. And then you would have a specific DNS record for your blog or whatever you're calling it, because you can select it, right? If you wanted to call it like newsletter or essays or like whatever you want, content dot whatever, you can select what the subdomain is, and you'd be setting that record in your DNS. And I would personally recommend Cloudflare because it makes it really easy to kind of do this across platforms, because it'll be a lot harder, if not, I'm not even sure if it's possible to like, let's say if you have, I have my domains, for example, in Namecheap, and then to like Namecheap has some routing, but Cloudflare makes it a lot easier to like compile the routing or the records across many different platforms. So because you would need the records for Squarespace routing through there, but then you would also want to add the record for Ghost if you're setting up Ghost.
Okay, cool. And I guess the final question was just, so for this business that I'm starting, you know, the SEO my question is, if I work with Squarespace with the tools that they have for SEO, will it still be a successful like way to publish my work, in the sense like will people be able to find me just by typing, I don't know, meditation or something like that? I'm still not sure. I haven't reached the SEO chapter. I'm still not quite sure how SEO works. But I was just curious.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the way I'd look at it is like you can use, some people use like no blog editor, right? Or no blogging tool, and they rank, right? Like if you create good content and it's published, it can like work if you, obviously like if you do SEO well and like, you know, you're writing content that people care about and about subjects that people are searching for, like it is possible to rank. The thing I would say that is if you have a platform like Ghost that is built for blogging, you're going to be more likely to rank, right? Because one, it's faster. It's a lot faster than something like a Squarespace, but also it's a lot more readable. Like the design is something that they've like tested and iterated on for years, just to be like, how can we create the most like readable environment, right, for a reader? And that matters for SEO, right? Because once you get to the SEO chapter, you'll see that usability is like one of the key inputs into the algorithm, right? So having like a quick site that's optimized for readability is actually something that will drive it. But again, it's not like a make or break. Like everything that goes into the Google algorithm is not just about like technical SEO. It's also about like how good is your content? Are people bouncing or not? Again, is it optimized for keywords that people are searching for? So once you get to the SEO chapter, you'll maybe understand some of this more. But the idea is that like you can still rank stuff. Like I don't want it to come across that like you need to use Ghost to rank things, because that's absolutely not true. But you're going to be more likely to, and you're kind of like setting yourself up to have like a good foundation such that like you don't have to worry about usability, because Ghost has that like as part of its platform, and you're just focusing on the content, if that makes sense. And I don't know if they've improved things. I will say, because this is like around a year ago when I was toying with like Squarespace's blogging platform, but there was like just a lot of features missing, even from the ability to like insert images or like embed tweets, or like there was just like certain things where I was
very
like
wonky.
Or I was like, why isn't this, like I was just very surprised that it wasn't there. And so if you're someone like more so like a Paul Graham writer, where you're like not embedding tweets and it very much is just like plain text, and like Squarespace is probably fine for that, right? But for example, when I write an article, I really do like, you know, embedding like a video that people can watch, or a GIF or a tweet or something. And I was just at the time, again, maybe it's changed, really surprised that that was not available in Squarespace. So that's why I love Ghost. It's just like the analogy I've given before is just like with anything, not just with blogging, there's always going to be sites that are built or tools that are built, which are normally like the giants that do everything kind of well. And then there's going to be niche tools that do one thing extremely well. And for important things, like I encourage people to find the tools that do things extremely well, right? So like with Ghost does, like I said, they don't do e-commerce, they don't do like landing pages, something like a WordPress or a Squarespace or a Wix. They do all that stuff, but they kind of do all of it well, none of it great. And that's why I was like, I'm a big fan of Ghost, because it's like just for blogging, not for anything else. They do that extremely well. And they've kind of like gone through all of the like nitty gritty things that the other companies can't focus on, because they have all of the other things they need to focus on. And they've just figured out how to do blogging extremely well. And I also personally just like enjoy using the platform. Like as someone, I haven't used Squarespace as much, but like WordPress, I've always found like actually surprisingly daunting and confusing and not like a good user experience, versus Ghost, I found the opposite.
Yeah. Okay, cool. That's super helpful, Steph. And I'm loving the course so far, and the book. It's really fantastic. So thank you for writing that and sharing it with the world.
Sure. Awesome. Thank you so much for the kind feedback. All right, I'm going to go down and read some more of these yellow questions. So if you're on the call, feel free to, as Fernando did, go off mute, but if not, I will read this aloud myself. Okay, so I'm working on an impact investing startup that aims to bring together two communities, finance and people traditionally not involved in finance, but heavily involved in causes like climate change, diversity, etc. While it's easy to identify each of these communities individually, I'm having a very hard time finding and targeting that overlap. Any advice on how to create a community that doesn't seem to exist yet by bringing people together from more mature communities? This is a really interesting question, because it is, you know, the more you niche down, sometimes the harder it is to build something. And like, maybe this is obvious, but just, you know, the reason that so many of the biggest newsletters or communities are about broad topics is it's just so much easier to acquire people, right? Because something like Morning Brew or The Hustle is able to easily run something like a Facebook ad, because again, the like swath of people that they're targeting is so broad. Versus if you're really looking for not just like people are interested in finance, but then some of these like impact topics, it can be really hard to like target people, or even know like what subreddit should I be posting on, or like, you know, what are my acquisition channels and where do these people hang out? I would, from my perspective, you can still do both and have your target be, you know, like the intersection of these two things. But I would try to figure out what your core persona is that is a little more broad. And of course you can niche down over time. But for example, if you're talking to people who are like interested in investing as one cohort of people, and then people interested in impact, it's like, which one of those is like the core of who you're trying to reach, and figure out which one or the other, and then have that more broad set of people that you can basically choose as your primary audience. And then that gives you a little more bandwidth to basically target people. And I think you'll be surprised that if you're targeting, for example, anyone interested in impact, you may actually just like naturally bring in people who like are interested in finance as some part of that. Basically what I'm saying is like, I talked about this in a previous AMA, but I think sometimes people try to basically like, they try to say I'm targeting this audience, but then also this audience, and also like, you know, this audience, so multiple audiences. And the problem with that is, again, it's the focus, and it's also like how niche some of those audiences are. And instead, what I encourage people to do is to find one primary audience that potentially, through like targeting that primary audience, they attract people in those secondary audiences, but that allows them to focus on the primary audience. So to give a concrete example, at Trends and The Hustle, we sometimes say we're targeting like operators of businesses, but then also sometimes we're targeting the entrepreneurs, like people building things, but then also investors, and also, you know, like just people interested in tech. And then we're like, which one is it, right? Because we're trying to, we do want to attract all these people, but which one should we focus on? And what we came to was we're going to focus on people who are like just like building incredible businesses, like the operators who are in the weeds, who are really talented, because if we're focused on them, then we're also going to kind of, if we're doing it well, we're also going to naturally attract the aspiring entrepreneur, so someone who's a little earlier on. Or also, if we're targeting like incredible operators and entrepreneurs, we're going to also kind of by proxy attract investors, for example, or people interested in the space. We're also by proxy going to attract people who are generally interested in technology. And so I would try to think, like, break this down and say, if I just attract people in finance, is this going to attract the people I want? Maybe the answer is no. And then you go back and if I just focus on impact and do it in a specific kind of way, will I naturally attract people who, you know, are invested in like funding the space? I think that one is probably more likely. So I would just kind of break down, like, how do I think through what are my like suite of audiences that I potentially could attract, but then how do I nail that down to a primary audience that is actually more achievable and is not so niche, because it can be really, really hard when you have such a niche audience to like figure out how to acquire them and how to bring those people in. So I don't know if this person is on the call, and if that answered your question, feel free, if you don't want to go off mute, to let me know in the chat. But yeah. Okay, great. Steve said that answered the question. And just, I was reading through the chat, and Daniel is correct that SEO depends on so many things. And he mentioned, like, if you want your stuff to rank, you need backlinks. That's part of domain authority. And like, just the platform that you're on, whether it's Ghost or otherwise, like, is not going to determine your stuff ranking. It will impact it potentially, but it's certainly not going to be like the key driver of your success with SEO. Okay, so monetization. If the person is on this call and wants to go off mute, feel free to. If not, I will read this aloud. Okay, so monetization. I've created a workshop as a distribution channel for my newsletter. I'm giving away access to my newsletter for free to participants in workshops. It makes sense at this time, in my opinion, because I need to build a list of subscribers to validate existing content. When should I stop giving away paid content, if ever? What metrics to watch out for? So the way that I would view this is, I mean, a lot of answers are typically like this, but there's no like binary correct point for you to stop charging for things, or even to start charging for things. The way I would view content in general, though, is as a marketer, a funnel, right? So when you have built up a free and or paid system, what you want to look out for is ideally you have people at the top of the funnel and then people like at several stages down the funnel. So for example, you can imagine like a very simple funnel, which would be a blog that generates a bunch of traffic at the top. That blog converts people into a newsletter, which is another stage in the funnel, a free newsletter. That newsletter has a paid tier. So that's a third stage of the funnel. And then after that paid tier, maybe you have one like keystone product that you sell, right? Maybe that's the fourth step of your funnel. So that would be like a relatively simple but robust funnel, because there's several stages that people can enter and engage with you. And the important part is that with any funnel, you likely need some sort of free thing that brings people in and drives awareness, right? So the reason I'm bringing this up is because I see tons of people who like gate their content immediately, and I'm like, where is that initial like awareness driver of your funnel? And it doesn't exist, and they're surprised that they can't grow it. And so sounds like for you, you've created workshops which you're giving away for free. It sounds like your newsletter is also free. I would think about what is the best like driver for that part of that top of the funnel part for you. I would guess from my experience, it would be something like a newsletter or a blog. Workshops itself, unless it's something that people are like searching for or like are really, you know, seeking out, aren't really going to be a great driver of the top of the funnel. Because even if you like, even if these are great workshops that help convert people to like be on your list, for example, you still need your list to let people know about the workshops, or maybe Twitter or whatever you're, because one thing to consider is it doesn't need to be like, you know, a newsletter or a blog. Like your top of the funnel could be Twitter, for example. You see tons of people do that. Oh shoot, this says it's going to end in 10 minutes. I forgot to upgrade my Zoom. I will upgrade it in a couple minutes, or actually what I'll do is I'll send you guys all a new link. I'm so sorry. I remembered to upgrade it last time, but I forgot. So I'll take a second after answering the next two questions and send out a new link. But yeah, so that's something to mention for this, like what metrics to watch out for. Well, I would try to see it, like just even draw out a funnel and say, these are my steps of the funnel. And then what I would try to watch out for is like, do I have a large group of people at the top of my funnel? And do I have like some sort of consistent engine of driving that, right? So again, like, do I have a lot of Twitter followers that engage with me consistently? Do I have a newsletter that, you know, people read every single week and it has this many thousand subscribers? Do I have a blog that brings in, you know, this much organic traffic every week? Like, you need some sort of top of the funnel metric. And I would kind of say before gating anything, or even especially before gating everything, you need that top of the funnel driver. And so I would look out for that to, do I have a consistent stream of awareness at the top of the funnel? And then I would, you know, also think about what I just mentioned before, which is like, not just should I gate something, but like, how does my full funnel look? Like ideally you have multiple steps, and ideally, you know, you have several types of free content and several types of paid content. So I would map that out, and maybe it's going to take time for you to like set a lot of that up so that it's like robust. So certainly you don't need this overnight, but that's what I would start to work towards. And again, I kind of think one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of content creators make is they gate too much stuff, which maybe some people would disagree with me on. But if truly you're thinking in the long time horizon, your best asset is your content working for you. So you definitely want at least something that is ungated and free earlier on in your funnel. So I hope that answered your question. Again, you can let me know in the chat if you don't want to go off mute. Oops, let me go back. I accidentally clicked one of my bookmarks.
Hi, am I on?
What's that? Sorry?
Sorry, you just answered my question. I was taken by surprise earlier, so I didn't read that out. Yes, that was actually quite helpful. And on the subject of gating content, I did find that initially I was overgating and letting people in through the workshops. But what I switched to was gating half the content, but then also using Ghost's new preview feature, which I meant like built into the theme, which allowed me to let people see like most of some content and only like keep some content gated where they'd have to sign up. So sort of turn them into what I hoped were lead magnets.
That's awesome. Yeah, exactly. So again, like there's no perfect way to say like this should be ungated versus this shouldn't, but I would say that again, like the perspective is that you need some sort of funnel, and then also you need to, or I encourage people to remember that your content is your best asset, and at least some of it, some of your best stuff should be, you know, a marketing tool for you, right? So don't gate all of it, like, and ideally, you know, have a system or like a strategy there for like why and when you're gating. And in general, I would encourage people, if you can, to not gate things immediately. And this obviously like relates to people's, you know, personal situations. If you need to make money right away, maybe you have to start charging for content immediately. But that's why in general, I kind of nudge people to remember that like content is a long-term game, and that you're much more likely to succeed if you're looking at it on that time horizon, which for a lot of people means like not getting stuff for many, many months, if not, you know, a year or so. So that's what I did. But again, there's no perfect approach, but that's kind of how I'd look at things. Okay, so let's do this next question, and then I will upgrade my Zoom. I'm so sorry again. Are there any areas where content creators need to be particularly concerned about legal issues? As an example, consultants typically get business insurance that covers professional liability. So this is an interesting question. I will start by saying I am not a lawyer, so obviously this is not legal advice. If you quit content online, you obviously are responsible for your content, and you can be sued, or you can be, you know, like someone can take legal action against you if you're doing something illegal. So the first thing obviously is like, hopefully don't do anything that's illegal, or, you know, don't steal other people's content. Again, not a legal expert, but what you may consider if you are writing content online, I would only really start to do this probably if you're like making money through your content. But one thing is like, yes, you can either get business or like liability insurance, or one way to like protect you is to have some sort of business structure like a corporation or an LLC, which does have the insurance, just that someone can still sue you. But when they sue you, they're suing your LLC or your corporation, which means the only assets that they can sue against are the things in that entity and not like your personal savings or, you know, your personal money outside of that LLC or corporation or whatever business structure you create. So that is one method of somewhat protection, but again, it still doesn't stop someone from being able to sue you. It just means that they can only sue you against what's in that entity and not like all of your personal assets. So I'll just stop there because that is like the extent that I know of for anything legal. And again, not legal advice. I think in general, one thing I've learned over the last couple years is that like to basically spend your time on what you're great at and to hire people who are experts in these areas. So for example, I had to get a visa last year, and at first I was like, oh, I'll just figure it out myself. So happy that I got, you know, a lawyer to help me with that. So in general, if you're concerned about any of this, there are tons of tools. For example, UpCounsel is a company that kind of lets you kind of like the like Upwork for lawyers, and you can actually talk to lawyers for like not a crazy rate on platforms like that. So if you are concerned, I would just you know, encourage you to talk to a lawyer. All right, so those are the ones in yellow. I want to stop for a second and see if anyone on this call still has questions that I've not covered. I'm still going to cover the other ones that are not in yellow in a second, but I wanted to stop for a second and give anyone else a chance to ask any questions. While I stop and wait for that, I'm going to quickly upgrade the Zoom. But yeah, is there anything else that people on this call are wondering about or struggling with? Feel free if you want to go in the chat or so just 1 second. And so sorry about this. This Zoom thing. I'm so used to using my corporate account, but this is my personal account. All right, seems like I've successfully renewed, or it says it's subscribing my plan. So yeah, if you have any, there we go. This meeting now has unlimited minutes. All right, let's jump right back in. Again, sorry about that, everyone. I'm gonna share my screen again. All right, let's jump in. So the next question, I'm gonna jump right back up to building your home and go through in sequence for the following things. So how important is it to have a writer that knows your industry? For example, someone wants to create The Hustle for his industry. It's pretty niche and he wants to curate stories and make them quirky like The Hustle for, I guess, an industry that would otherwise be boring. Not being an SME, do we run the risk of turning off our audience given that they are experts or know better? I ask that because we've tried agencies in the past to write blogs for us, and although they are great for SEO, we feel that clients get turned off because it is not quite the content level they may expect. Just wondering how they may affect our success rate. My thought is just to roll the dice and rely on entertaining and informing our audience and direct them to related content, much like The Hustle does. So this is a great question, and it's asked a lot in this. I want to talk about two things. One, how important it is to hire experts, but then two, the importance of differentiating, and that differentiating does not necessarily need to be like higher quality, like more deeply researched content. So the first one is, I do actually think it's important to hire people who really know a lot about an industry. Now, does this mean they need a PhD about a particular thing? Absolutely not. But the reason that it's important to actually hire people who know about something quite well is because, as this actually relates to the second thing I'm going to talk about, but in order to differentiate, right? Remember, we talked about in the book, like you can be funnier, you can be more visual, you can be more deeply researched, you can be more contrarian. Like there's so many adjectives that you can be. But in order to be any of those things, you need to have the starting platform of knowing what the hell you're talking about, right? It's similar to, as someone who only really speaks English, I can't resonate with this as much, but people generally say that they feel like they can speak a language well if they can, use humor in it, right? That's when they feel like, oh, I finally am like getting this language. It's the same thing with writing content, where you can't really start to use humor with content if you don't know what the hell you're talking about, right? Because it's going to fall flat. Similarly, you can't really start to like build incredible data visualizations if you don't really know what data you should be using. And so if you even want to start differentiating in all these ways, I do actually think having like a foundation of knowing what you're talking about is really important. That's what, even at The Hustle, someone like Trung, a lot of people commend Trung for his humor, which he's so funny, but he also knows so much about business, and he spent many years at several companies, like going through like public filings and like building models about like how businesses are evaluated. And like he has done the time to understand business so that now he can be pretty funny with it, right? Like because he understands what the baseline is. And so I think the same thing is true with whatever you're building. If you want it to be funnier or again more contrarian, whatever the like angle or the slant that you want, the underlying necessity is that you know what you're talking about. And again, you don't need to be like the absolute best person in that field, but you should have a pretty good understanding of it, or the person you're hiring should, right? And I think this speaks to what you've probably experienced here, which is that if you've tried agencies, those agencies are great at one thing, which is maybe creating content, but they don't know what the hell you're writing about. And so that's, from my experience, also been the case, where hire an agency to write articles, like it's always going to be pretty mediocre. So I would personally encourage you to find someone who does know a lot about a particular space, hire them, and then you can teach people to write. You truly can. I think that's the more likely, it's not guaranteed to succeed, but the more likely chance of success is hiring someone who's an expert in something and teaching them to write than hiring a writer and teaching them about a particular subject. So that's the first thing I would say. And then the second thing that's important here and related is this idea of finding your slant, right? And we've talked in the past about, again, all the different ways that you can be more of something, but you do need to be significantly better at one thing than what exists out there. And so if you want to be more entertaining, that's one way to like choose your angle. But it's just important to note that like, just because I'm saying that you hire an expert does not mean that your content needs to be like more like researched or more like long. A lot of people think quality equals length, and it doesn't. So I would just ask yourself, like, first, what is our angle? Like, what are we actually trying to be? We're trying to be more funny. We're trying to be more what with our audience. Why are we choosing that slant? Is that something our audience cares about? If it is, great. And then how do I find someone who is an expert who can do that for us, right? And again, I would encourage you, don't, in general, one thing when people are hiring people is they tend to like look for previous writers, which can work, right? They look for like a previous journalist, for example. And from my experience, what I've been much more successful in is hiring people who are truly great at what they know, as in like the industry that they know or their background, and then teaching them perhaps to write a little bit better or to write in your voice, for example, but not the other way around. Can work where they're like a double hitter and they're great at both. For example, Zach is someone on our team who is a previous journalist who also does have like just incredible business chops, but I think that's quite rare. So I would, in general, find someone who knows a lot about a subject and then perhaps teach them a little more about writing. And yes, I saw in the chat, Trung is a legend, but again, he knows a lot about business himself. So it's not just, he can't be funny if he doesn't know what people care about in the space. So, okay, hopefully that answered that person's question. Let me know if not in the chat or to go off mute. I'm going to move on to, oh, they're not on this call if it's not in yellow. So I'm just going to keep moving through these quickly. The next one is distribution. So I guess they have a new D2C brand in the health and wellness space, providing organic and natural supplements and a platform to connect with nutritionists and doctors, which you advise me to launch and grow. So I always tell people that I have a lot of people, especially after this book, reach out to me and say, hey, Steph, like, here's my concept for a newsletter or a product. Should I launch it? Like, what should I do differently? And I actually built this site called I just built it on Cards, so it took like 5 minutes. But I think I've actually started to send this to people, and you can see I've got 2 canons. So that's why some things are in Spanish. But it basically says like, sorry, I'm not your user. And therefore, like, even if you, which I think is very kind, think I'm like smart or knowledgeable about business building or content building, I have no idea if you will be successful with this amount of information, right? Because, well, there's two things. One, a concept in itself does not tell you anything about the success of it, because an idea is only worth so much, and execution is a bulk of the success of many things. If you guys aren't familiar with this, just look up Ideas versus Execution by Derek Sivers. And it's basically this what I just talked about, where ideas are worth almost nothing. And I think he was the first one to like come up with this framework. And execution is worth much more. And therefore, like, even the most brilliant idea with no execution is worth $20. But you know, the most brilliant idea with great execution turns into $20 million, and you can kind of multiply out all of these. And so the only thing that he says here is like, you know, an awful idea is like reverse. But most ideas are not awful, right? Most ideas are actually mediocre. So I think a lot of people think like there's good ideas and bad ideas. I think there's very rarely good ideas, very rarely bad ideas, and a lot of mediocre ideas that can be compounded by execution. So getting back to the question, the reason I'm kind of avoiding it is actually by saying like, okay, so you want to create a D2C brand in this space. That could be extremely successful, and it could be extremely unsuccessful, because it's not the idea itself that, you know, will lend to this success. It's how are you actually creating this brand? Is it differentiated in some way? And yeah, like, how well are you going to execute on this? To give a related example, content wise, I constantly have people come to me and say, I'm going to create a newsletter about X. This is actually part of the first chapter. And if you were to come to me and say, I'm writing a newsletter about tech, that tells me zero about the success of that newsletter, because again, it's all about execution, but also it's like, what's your angle, right? What's your differentiator? And you simultaneously see some of the biggest newsletters in the world write about tech, but then every single day someone's starting a new newsletter about tech that's unsuccessful. So it's not actually the concept itself, right, that is determining the success. It's the combination of the differentiator, so how someone is actually approaching this that's different than what already exists, and how they execute on it, right, over time. So in terms of like, how would I advise you to launch and grow? I think like, as someone not in the space, this is what like not your user is important. I don't know that much about like nutritionists and doctors, so, but I would, if you know a lot about this space, to whoever asked this question, I would first start about like, how do I create an MVP where I can start testing things and getting things out there and getting feedback, right? Whether it's like articles, whether it's creating like a very basic version of the product and seeing if you're getting any sort of traction. Because one of the things to keep in mind is like, this seems like partially a like content play, but also like a product play. And the thing that I see people do too often is they spend so much time like thinking about how they should approach things, instead of creating things and getting them out to market and actually seeing how the market responds, right? So I guess in terms of like answering a question about how would I advise you to launch and grow, I would create some sort of MVP of the product itself, get it out to market as soon as possible. Obviously, like, it sounds like supplements, so be safe and, you know, compliance and all that. And try to also, like, as you're trying to validate anything, like, you must come up with a hypothesis of what you're trying to validate or invalidate. A lot of people also just like go to market with something and they're just like, oh, like, I launched, and it's like, okay, well, what were you testing? What were you trying to learn, right? So you want to, whenever you're going to market, actually have a clear hypothesis of like what would make this successful or what wouldn't. So that's for the product side. But then for the content side, I mean, I would find out who your people are, what angle, what differentiator you want, right? So just because you're a D2C brand, there's many different D2C brands that specialize or are known for different things. So find your angle and then start creating content and see if that resonates with people. So I know that's a vague answer, and I went through like a bunch of different kind of like frameworks, but I think those are actually important, because I can't tell you exactly how to launch and grow this, especially with this amount of information. But I would try to get things out there as soon as possible and make sure whatever you're creating has a differentiator. Like, just being a D2C brand in a popular space is not going to get you very far. And just to close this out, see if I can find chapter 1. I wanted to just bring up one image that I think will relate to this. which is here, saturation is not the number of people in the space. It is the likelihood that you can out innovate what already exists. This is true for content. This is true for companies. This is true for products. So whenever it sounds like you've already decided on your product, but you need to basically find an industry. It sounds like you found your industry and figure out, how can I take whatever exists out there already and be at least 1% better than what already exists there. And so for something like a D2C supplement brand, maybe you're cheaper, but maybe you're actually like, the supplement actually works better in some way, shape, or form. Maybe you're just like more familiar and it's like more of like a Flintstones type brand. That's what Flintstones is, right? Flintstones doesn't taste that great. It's more familiar than what already exists out there. And so I think, just to summarize, and sorry, this was such a long answer, is you need to figure out what your differentiator is in the space and then like focus on that lane and then launch it before you're ready, as people say, and make sure that you're developing some sort of hypothesis that you can validate or invalidate on launch. I can see MC has your hand up. So now that I'm done with this question, feel free to go off mute, and I'm happy to answer your question.
Hi, thanks. I just thought I'd jump in with a question I wasn't planning on asking before, but
Sure.
I realized it became relevant from the answer you gave earlier to one of my questions. So I found that my audience, as far as I know, does not exist on Twitter so far. But if I do some more digging, it might be that they would exist on Twitter or something like Instagram. I've so far eschewed social media as a distribution channel or inbound channel of any type. But if I were to say activate either one of those, how would I go about, actually, how do I phrase this? I have an existing Twitter handle, but it's in a completely different audience. It's before I started doing this business, I was a developer and that's where developers hang out. So I had a Twitter handle. But if I were to switch it over, I feel like it would just be so jarring. It just seems inadvisable. So, but I wasn't sure because it takes a lot of time to grow an audience. So I wonder what you thought about that.
So it'd be helpful to know, like, what is the two things that you're pivoting between? Because if they're completely unrelated, then yes, my advice is like, start new, basically. Are they related in any sense? So for example, like some of the things that I write about maybe aren't the same, but for example, I'll write about tech, but I'll also write about remote work or productivity. And those are different lanes, but they're related. And someone who likes one may actually, also like another. So are they completely disjointed or are they related?
That's a fair question. If I were to answer that, I would say they're related as stretch. So as I was a remote working software engineer and I've switched to making a business that trains and teaches and puts out content for people who work remotely, cybersecurity resources for people who work remotely and are starting online businesses. So they're related because, well, a lot of these people are working remotely like I used to. They're also sort of related in the sense that I'm giving people advice from the perspective like what happens in the bowels of software and how you should think about security. So in that way, they're related. But from an outsider, it might not feel that way.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. And one final just follow up before I answer is, are you planning to use that Twitter account if you don't use it for this? As in like whatever you had built it up about, like those topics, are you planning to still, leverage that, or is that kind of dead if you're not using it for this purpose?
Oh, I'd gone private because to focus on this business, it was just basically taking all my bandwidth. So I wasn't engaging with my community at that time, but I would like to reconnect with them because I was active in open source. So that would be part of my way back in.
Yeah, I think so. So you're more experienced in this space than I am. So I do think it would be a little bit jarring, but from the two topics that you described, I don't actually think they're so disjointed. Like I've seen people pivot in much more like significant ways. The way that I would view it is that every time, whether it's through Twitter or your newsletter or, a podcast, like you've developed some sort of contract with your audience, and that contract sometimes is more explicit than others, but in general, the contract for something like Twitter is like, okay, I followed this person because they tweet about these kinds of things around this often, and I get around, this kind of value from them. And so that's why someone followed you. Now, again, Twitter tends to be a less explicit contract than something like a newsletter where someone's like literally subscribing and like, you have more clear expectations of the type of content that you're getting. I personally would say that if you're not planning to really use this Twitter outside of your current projects very much, that I think based on the two subjects not being so different, I would use the existing Twitter account. Again, there's not like a correct answer here, but like you said, it can be quite hard to build up a Twitter account from scratch. And these two ideas don't seem so disjointed that I could easily see someone who was interested in your earlier work being interested in your later work. And obviously the risk runs that the reason I asked you if you're going to use this account elsewhere is because if you're planning to use this account for some of the other topics that you're writing about, then I would advise you otherwise, as in like, I would advise you to create two separate accounts. But if you're not planning to use it, then, starting from, I don't know how many thousand followers you have is better than starting from 0, because some portion of those people will be interested. So that's kind of like the layup that you're getting. So I don't know if that helps answer your question, but that's the reason I asked those like follow-up questions is like, are you going to use that? If yes, then like start a new one. If no, use that account. And also how disjointed are they is important. And it sounds like they're actually not as disjointed as some people when they're pivoting. It sounds actually like some not trivial percentage of your existing followers will be interested in the new stuff.
Thank you. That was a very well considered answer, and it put me on a better track for understanding where I might go with this. I appreciate your weighing in and asking the follow-ups too.
Sure.
Next step.
Yeah, no problem. And if you have any other questions, feel free to chime in. Until then, I am going to go through some of these other questions in the podcasting. So I'm planning to launch a website that reviews eco-friendly products in different categories and provides recommendations. How would you recommend growing users on the website? So again, there's no perfect way to grow things, but I would say, so if you are running some sort of e-commerce, or sorry, this is a review site, not an e-commerce site. I got confused for a second. So, but in general, so for reviews, people aren't gonna go like find your review site. No one's searching for you to start with, but a review site actually can benefit from like long tail SEO, right? So for whatever products that you're actually having on your site, someone is likely searching for like review, I don't know, like paper straws, reviews like this company's like plastic water bottles, whatever it is, they're probably searching for these things. And so the first thing that comes to mind actually in realizing that you're a review site, not a product site where you're selling the stuff, is that people are looking for reviews. And so you probably can develop a pretty solid long tail SEO strategy here. And then I also would, it sounds like you need to focus on like the top of the funnel of like bringing users in. And of course, like there's going to be other keyword search volume for the products on your site, not just reviews, but like how to best use this like eco-friendly product, whatever it is, or like how to get this cheaper, or where to find this eco-friendly product. Like there's going to be, I think, some pretty consistent, almost like keyword patterns that you can search for. And in Ahrefs, I can actually, I know this person's not on the call, but I can show you guys how to do some of this stuff. So in Keywords Explorer, I'm trying to think of like an eco-friendly product, but like, I'll just say like alumina or metal straw, I don't know. So you can look in here, and then what you can find is that there's different keyword ideas, and there's different like keyword patterns, right? So there's matching terms, related terms, search suggestions, and I'm trying to remember, so there's like these questions as well, but I'm trying to remember, I haven't done this in a little bit of time, but here, the matching terms, this is what I'm looking for. So you can look for all of these keyword patterns of like metal straw, metal boba straw, blah, blah, blah. But you can also look for these like specific types of patterns. So it seems like people are looking for like folding metal straws and like bendable metal straws. And I'm sure there's like other patterns that are more so like question formatted as well, but you get a sense of like the types of things that people are looking for. And then you can create basically like a long tail SEO strategy for these things. So maybe people are, 4,000 people are searching for metal straw, but maybe like very few people are searching for like metal collapsible straw for boba, but that is a long tail keyword if you set up your site properly that you can rank for effectively, because not a lot of other people will be creating pages specifically for that. And if you're interested in this, you can look up like Nomad List, long tail, Harry Dry wrote about this, and it's pretty solid. So on his marketing examples, you can look up Nomad List dominates longer tail keywords. And they basically do the same thing where basically Peter figured out the search query patterns. So like least racist sites, but then he also, would do things like safe, warm cities near a beach, right? So again, these are like the patterns of insertion that people may be searching for. And I think if you're doing a review site, this could be a really easy strategy for you for, again, like maybe whatever your eco-friendly products are, people are probably searching for like variations of that product itself, but then again, like where to find this, or like cheapest version of X, or like there's going to be certain queries. And if you do more research in something like Ahrefs, where in addition to matching terms, if I go back to the overview section, you can also see all these questions, which are also like really, really easy for you to work with, where like how to clean a metal straw, like how much does it cost? Again, some of these keyword structures I would encourage you to tackle. And that sounds like the most likely way for you to build up traffic to your review site, because it's not something that you're going to get as much traction with on social, I don't think. And then there probably is a play as well of working directly with the products itself, similar to what Trustpilot has done, where if you get a lot of reviews on your site for these particular products and they're good reviews, these sites are going to want to showcase that to their customers on their site. And so what Trustpilot has done is basically like they now have like a widget that people can embed on their site to be like, look, we got like 4.8 stars on Trustpilot. So that's also like another growth hack that you might consider about creating a widget that people can embed on their site, which is basically them, marketing for you. So those are some quick ways that I would start, because again, I don't think things like social or posting about something on Hacker News is going to work for you. And I think it'd be hard to create a really highly engaging newsletter, although you could do it potentially in a way where people subscribe, where you showcase the best products of the week or something like that. But I would focus for this review site on SEO almost certainly. Okay, what criteria do you use when hiring a content writer? So this relates to one of the things that I talked about before, which is just, I in general encourage people to hire people who know a lot about the topic that you care about. That's actually the biggest prerequisite, which sometimes people are surprised by because again, they're like, oh, it's not that they have like incredible writing chops. I actually think writing is something that you can teach. And I know this firsthand because I've learned it from many people and was not a great writer for a long time. And so I think the most important thing is, do they know a lot about a particular subject? And then tied to that, another question that is especially relevant to some industries more so than others, but trends, for example, one of the biggest things that we look for, which is kind of hard to both articulate and judge people by, is basically, can they identify what is quality or interesting? And to kind of explain this more, for example, at Trends, we can teach someone to write, we can teach someone to do the research, we can teach people how to find data. What we can't do as easily is teach them to identify what is truly interesting, right? Like what is truly like a wow moment when people read it? What is truly like when readers engage with it, they're like, I cannot get this anywhere else. And so that is especially hard to do. And one of the things that I encourage you to do early on, if you're hiring a writer, is not just, for example, say, hey, here's an article that we want you to write, please go write it. It's to say, can you propose a bunch of topics? Like if you were running this team, like what are the topics that you would write about? Because that gives you the opportunity to see like when they are being creative and they're thinking up different ideas, like what does that manifest as? And that is actually like one of the most important things, because again, you can teach people the skills and how to do something, but you can't really teach them how to think about something, if that makes sense. And in general, I think one important addition that I'll add to this is that one of the best ways to hire amazing writers is to look for people who write really effectively online, both again in the like quality of their writing, but also the like kind of imaginative side of their writing. What are they doing on their own? And that's why actually a lot of the people who we've hired, we kind of look for ourselves. We look for people on Twitter. I think Sam originally found Trung on Twitter or something like that. Sam found me on Twitter, certainly. And so look for people who on their own accord, on their own time, are doing really exciting, interesting things. And then you're going to be much more likely for that person to succeed in your environment versus people coming inbound. So inbound obviously is a channel for recruiting that I'm not trying to discount, but especially for writing, I think some of our most successful hires have been outbound. So I know some of those sound like vague criteria points, but one, make sure that they know a lot about the subject that you're writing about, right? Again, they don't need a PhD, but that they know a lot. Two, I generally look for like, do they enjoy writing? Do they do this like on their own accord? They have their own newsletter, their own podcast, their own Twitter, where they're actively doing things on their own. And then three, like test them, always have some sort of assessment. Now you can obviously pay people for these assessments, and we actually do this at The Hustle, but in the assessment, make sure you're not just verifying their skill level in writing, but also their ability to be creative, and make sure that you ask them to come up with different topics. Because if you're just giving them the topics, you're not actually vetting that mechanism. Okay, what are the effective ways to quickly grow your audience if you are if you are a business just starting out? So there's so many different distribution mechanisms. I would encourage whoever wrote this to go look at the distribution section. But in order to quickly grow your audience, I mean, in one of the key lessons in the distribution section is that there are quicker ways to build up an audience quickly by, for example, trending on Hacker News or any of these like highly viral platforms, because you get this big surge, but then again, that surge disappears. And so if you really want to grow quickly, you might kind of focus on some of those things, but I wouldn't actually encourage people to think about content in like, how do I like grow this thing as fast as possible? So in general, the distribution approach is always like, who is my audience? Where do they hang out? Okay, I'm going to focus on those platforms. I'm going to explore and exploit. I'm going to try a bunch of them out and see which ones stick. And then once I explore, I'm going to exploit, which means I'm going to focus on just a few channels and doing it really, really well. And then not always the case, but almost always the case, I encourage people to invest in SEO, because it's one of the only channels that has the bedrock nature to it, which means that every single day when you wake up, the output that you get is not a function of what you did the day before. It's a function of what you've done for many, many weeks or months or years, which is, again, it's this bedrock that you can build on top of. So whoever asked this question, I would encourage them to go take a deeper look at the distribution section, but I would use that framework of who's my audience, where they're hanging out. Okay, these are the channels I'm going to explore, exploit, and then, you know, focus on the ones that seem to resonate best with my audience. How would you recommend any GPT-3 tools such as Copy.ai to write content? Are there any digital tools you recommend to create content? So I haven't used Copy.ai myself to create content, but I've seen it been done. And of course, there's all these articles online that say like, you didn't know, but this article was written by GPT-3 and things like that. So my opinion is, again, one of the most underrated parts of a great writer is not just their writing, but their ability to come up with really, really interesting concepts. And GPT-3 doesn't work unless you give it the input, right? As in, if you feed it what you want it to build off of. And so the first thing is like, don't use GPT-3 to come up with ideas, because ideas almost certainly are not going to be great. So make sure that you're focusing on like, what does my audience really need? What are the ideas that I'm going to build? And then if you want to use GPT-3, again, I'm not personally using it. What I would encourage you to do is like, go and get it to write an article or two, and then never just publish the GPT-3 article. I think if anything, at least at its current form, this may change with, you know, the evolution of the technology. It can be a good way to like basically build like a really, really like quick outline or a quick first draft of what you might want to talk about. And then I would take that and be like, okay, I need to basically edit it as an editor. And then as you're editing it as an editor, I would like put your expert hat on and be like, is this really great? And if it's not great, like what's missing from this? So I don't think you should ever just publish, from my perspective, just like a purely GPT-3 written article. And again, that is as of today, like July 2021, this may change. But in general, I would say you can potentially use it to like fast track your article, but I wouldn't use it kind of on its own. And in general, digital tools, there are tons of tools in the end of doing content, right? There's in the bonus section, it outlines a bunch of tools for content, whether it's the creation of content or the distribution of it. But I think in general, most tools are not going to do the trick for you, right? It's like your content has to be great on its own. So there's no single tool that I would say is like going to be game changing for you in that way. There's obviously, if you go to the end of the book, there's obviously some tools like Readwise that help you like easily organize information. I use Draftback when I'm editing things, which is a great tool for like seeing how your workflow works. But in general, again, like no tool is going to like make or break your content. And I would be like, GPT-3 is incredible what it can do, but I would just like have your expert hat on if you are using it to make sure that the content that it's spitting out is truly great, or make it great. And then the final question is about audio and podcasting. So what are the top strategies to grow your podcast audience? So I would encourage you to go through the podcast section if you haven't already. I will go through a couple different things, but I'm going to pull this up as like a basis for some of the things I'm going to discuss. So the first thing is what I had mentioned earlier in this call, which is that podcasts are just a form of content, right? So a lot of people are like, it's time to create a podcast. Everyone's creating podcasts. I'm also working on a podcast, but just remember that like it is just one form of content. And the reason it's taking off is really not because it's like special today, but because, well, one, we have better tools than ever, right? So one of the key takeaways from from doing content, right, is that we're in this information age, partially because of the tools that we have today that enable us to build almost anything online. The same thing is true with podcasting. In the last couple of years, whether it's Descript or Megaphone or Anchor, like there's so many tools that allow you to create podcasts so much more easily. And then another underrated part is just that we're in the mobile first kind of revolution, which includes things like AirPods, which make it a lot easier for people to engage with audio more consistently. So basically, unsurprisingly, we're seeing a lot more audio. Okay, cool. The thing I wanted to mention though, and this relates to the question about how to grow a podcast, is that we're still, at least compared to written content, very early in the ecosystem. So you can see here, if you were to imagine like all of the ways that people find content, written content, I should say here, it's through a lot of the stuff we talked about in DCR, search engines, social media, communities, directories, like viral platforms like Hacker News, through ads. In terms of also featuring content, features that augment content. So things like when you read an article, if I'm reading an article on the web, maybe I save it to Pocket, maybe I comment on it, maybe I search the article itself and highlight things, maybe the article is paywall, maybe I take the article, copy that into my other browser and send it in WhatsApp. So these two things in terms of how you find content and also how you engage with it, with written content, is really built out. Of course, it'll still evolve, but it's really built out. Now imagine asking that same question for audio and it's not quite there, even though we've evolved a lot. So you're not really seeing great search engines for audio, not really great communities or directories or viral platforms where I'm sure this will be created, but imagine a platform with just snippets of podcasts, like not the full podcast, but snippets of podcasts. And it's like a Hacker News where you upvote it, but as you're on the Hacker News, instead of like opening up a tab and reading an article, you're listening to that snippet of a podcast, right? That's going to exist at some point. I don't know who's going to build it, but those things are all being built out, right? So again, how to find content, also how to engage with content. And the reason I'm mentioning this is it all ladders up to where we are today, where if you were starting a podcast, because this ecosystem is still quite early, it is hard to grow a podcast. It's funny because a lot of people create podcasts because they think it'll be easier. And it is sometimes easier to create a podcast than it is to write an article, but it is much harder to grow it. And that's important, right? Because building an audience is not just about the creation, it's also about the sharing of your content. And that's why if you look here, these are the most listened to podcasts in 2020. And if you look at most of them, they are either the individual or the company, kind of like the media brand backing the podcast, are like already had huge audiences, right? So Joe Rogan, New York Times, NPR, Barstool, things like, you know, Bill Burr, Rachel Maddow, like these people all had some audience beforehand. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is not because it's impossible to successfully grow a podcast, but just know that most of the most successful podcasts grow off of an existing audience. Even My First Million, which I personally love from The Hustle, like Sam and Sean do an awesome job, but it grew off of a 1 million person email list, right? Like where we could advertise it in the email every single week. So if you are growing a podcast, getting back to the question, the question is like, do you have some sort of mechanism to drive traffic to this podcast on your own? Or do you already have that mechanism? Do you have an email list? Do you have a blog? Do you have like a show, like a TV show? Do you have some sort of audience? Do you have a Twitter audience, for example? You need some sort of, speaking of funnels again, some sort of funnel to drive people into the podcast, because the podcast itself is going to be really hard to discover in a search engine because there is no search engine for it to be discovered, right? It's not really, there's not really like a great social media audio platform. So it's probably not going to be the channel that you grow through that. All of these things, again, are being built, and it's really exciting because I think in the next like couple years, we're going to look back and be like, wow, even in 2021, audio was really early. But the point is that if you're trying to grow it in 2021, do I have some sort of mechanism or way to reach people already? And the answer is no. It's not that you shouldn't create a podcast, but you should maybe have realistic expectations about how it'll grow. And then tied to this, I'm just going through and again, I would encourage you to go through this section. There's a couple of videos, they're not super long, that actually go through the concepts here. And then the thing that I wanted to focus on is, well, one quick thing before going into the key answer is just one other thing about podcasting is I think it's also very early on in the style or format, which means that if you think about video as another medium, video is actually further along than audio, where if you think about the different types of videos that exist, you have vlogs or documentaries, product reviews, tutorials, interviews, conversations, and more, right? So if you go on YouTube, there's so many different formats for how people use video. If you think about the equivalent in audio, it's still really early, right? So you typically only really listen to podcasts that are interview style or conversations. Sometimes they're more story type podcasts, like documentary-esque, but there's still a lot of ways that you could create new podcasts that are different, right, in format. And so that's just something to keep in mind. If you are creating a podcast, don't feel like you need to just create another interview style podcast, because there's many other options. So getting back to where is it? Podcast creation and then growing your podcast. So the things that I would really recommend in terms of growing a podcast is, first, similar to creating a blog or a newsletter, like you need to figure out what your lane is and what you're incredible at. And in order to do that, what a lot of people do that I see create podcasts is they'll just create a podcast and then launch it. And then whatever they started as, like, continues to be what their podcast is forever. Just like what you do with like a product or a company, you need to iterate with your podcast, right? So whatever you start out as doesn't mean that that's what you need to continue as. So for example, even My First Million from The Hustle, they actually started as an interview style podcast with Sean, and then they tested new episode formats, and Sam came on and they were riffing, and people seemed to love that episode. So that's what they ended up turning the podcast into. So I would encourage people to create a minimum viable podcast, which basically is like a pilot of 1 to 3 episodes. Go share those episodes, see if people like them, get feedback on what they like or don't like, and then iterate, right? Iterate based on the feedback that you're getting on those podcast episodes. Also, bite-size your content, especially if you're doing a long podcast. So let's say your podcast is like an hour. It's going to be really hard to convince someone to take an hour out of their day to listen to your podcast. But what's a lot easier to do is to take snippets of that podcast, share it on platforms like Twitter or Instagram, where people are, maybe already following you, for example, and get them to bite-size your content so that people can engage at a lower friction level, right? So that it's not, oh, I need to go like download all these episodes from the pod. It's like, okay, I'm seeing all these snippets and they're quite cool and funny and engaging. And then after maybe they see like 5 of them, they're like, oh, maybe I'll actually go listen to the whole pod. So bite size your content and take your podcast content and share it on all these other platforms that are more developed, right? Remember I mentioned that the audio ecosystem is not very developed. Well, take that content, bite size it, or adjust it so that it's video content or written content so that you can leverage all those existing platforms. And then there's a bunch of other stuff here in terms of like helping people help you, which is like creating it a really simple podcast page that helps people subscribe. A lot of people, for example, if they're promoting their podcast, will direct people straight to Apple Podcasts. I think that's fine if you're trying to specifically growth hack it and like work your way up the charts. But if you are just in your early stages and you are trying to get people to subscribe to your podcast, create a podcast page that makes it really clear what your podcast is. Again, bite-size some of the content, make it really easy to subscribe from different platforms, right? Because if someone goes to if you send people to Apple Podcasts, but they're on Android, like that's not very helpful to those people. So for example, I created this page for us at My First Million, and you can see here, it's not amazing. It's actually created with a page or a tool. I think it's called Pod Pages, I think. Let me see, Pod. Maybe it's not Pod Pages. Actually, I think it is. Yes, it's this Pod Page. And so I use that, and then I also added some other things like bite-sizing our content, right? Or email. One of the things to keep in mind here is, remember, audio is really early on. And so if you send someone to a page like this and they don't subscribe, you potentially have lost them forever, right? But if you get their email, you can continue to send them updates. And so one of the things I would encourage people to do is if you have a podcast, don't make it audio only, meaning like leverage some of these other existing more developed tools like an email newsletter to update people on the podcast, or to convert people who maybe weren't ready to listen right away to listen in the future. So coming back to the slides here, there's a bunch of suggestions here of like things that help people make it a little easier for you to, for them to engage with your podcast. But overall, I think what I would encourage you to do is hopefully take some of the nuggets that I just went over, but also go through the podcasting section if you haven't already. And final note, which is related to many people or many of the things that we've already talked about in this session, which is if you have a podcast and you don't have an existing audience to drive people to that podcast already, do not gate your podcast. Gating podcasts is something that is new and exciting. It's part of this like ecosystem that's developing, but just like written content, if you don't have something at the top of the funnel, then don't get your content, because how else are people going to find you or engage with you? So that's what I would say on podcasts. I hope that was helpful to whoever added it here. I'm just scrolling through. It seems like we answered all the questions, but I'm going to take a minute just for anyone who's still on the line. Thank you for sticking around if you're still here. If you have any final questions, feel free to add them to the chat or go off mute. And yes, so Naya asked, this is really helpful. Will we have access to these slides? So yes, actually, if you go to, what's it called? DCR directory. Yes, here. So if you go to, and I will send this in the chat, the link, there is this directory that people can go to, and it is, I think I just had it up here, DCR direct. So if you go to bit.ly/DCR-resources, I sent it in the chat as well. But for people listening perhaps to the recording, if you go to this link, you will go to, or you get to this resources directory. And in this directory, there's a bunch of different resources, but you can see the bonus, sorry about this toucan, let me just close this. You will see this bonus chapter on podcasting. And if I go here, then you will see these 4 videos. So you can see the 4 videos here, and then you can also find the slides linked here, and you can watch the 4 videos in a playlist here if you're interested. And then just if people aren't familiar with this kind of like directory, this is also where you can find the slides from previous live sessions. So we did kind of like a live session for every chapter earlier on when the book was first launched. And so you can find the slides for those and the recordings for those. Each of the slides and recordings, I'll just show you, if I go to any of the recordings here, they're timestamped as well on YouTube, which means that, as you can see here, throughout the live sessions, tons of people were asking questions just like this bonus AMA. So if you haven't, you can kind of scan through and be like, oh, I really want to listen to this question, and they're timestamped. So if you click to it, you'll go to the actual timestamp as well. And I'm just trying to think if there's anything else worth mentioning in here. There's also, we talked about tools at some points in here. This is where you can find, if it's also in the book itself, like in the download, but if you're interested in any of the tools that I covered in Doing Content Right, there is this big list of tools kind of organized by category. And thank you to one of the readers, Joao, who helped compile this into Notion. And yeah, I guess I should update this. But basically, that's it. So if you have any final questions, I see Jackie was asking, do you have any advice for how to get buy-in from an employer if you're in a more traditional field where it's frowned upon to have side hustles outside of work? Have you ever experienced pushback yourself? So this is really tough because it's like, I actually haven't received that much pushback in my career, but I also have kind of intentionally sought out companies that have flexible work policies, for example, or that allow you to work on things on the side. That's almost like a prerequisite for me in the work that I look for. And I know that's a kind of like a privileged position to come from because some people don't have that. I think in general, what a lot of people worry about is, as in the companies worry about, is that if you're working on these side projects, like how could you do a good job? And I think if you're doing like the prerequisite first is like do a great job in your work. I'm assuming, Jackie, you already do that. Then I would go directly to your manager and be like, almost like get ahead of the problem, meaning that I think sometimes employers may frown upon things if they, for example, like find out through your Twitter or something else, like, oh, I didn't know you were working on this. And then they just feel like, you're doing things almost like behind their back, or you're like avoiding telling them for a specific reason. And so I know this isn't super helpful, but what I would say is like, I would go to your manager and say, hey, like, I love working here. I really value my job, but I also value, my ability to be creative outside of work, or to, build these things that I'm really excited about. And they only really take up this much of my time, but I wanted to tell you directly so that you're not like blindsided or surprised or upset by me working on these things. And then almost like introduce it in a way of like, do you have any questions, or like, do you have any concerns, so that they can voice them if they have them, but then that can be kind of addressed there. And I think hopefully with like a lot more people working remotely since the pandemic, people will be more open to this because they can't fully control their employees in the same ways as before. But I guess my main piece of advice, which I know is limited because I haven't had as many experiences with this, like as in with the pushback, is just to address it very directly with your employer and say, this is what I'd like to work on. And I think with that direct nature or like approach, I think that they're more likely to say yes, when in fact, I know it can be difficult. I will say actually the one experience that I did have is when I first started work, I worked in kind of a traditional business consulting role. And the reason that I would encourage you to address it directly and quickly is because I actually spent the greater part of that year being like, I want more flexibility, and looking for a remote job, to the point where I eventually found a remote job, ended up leaving the company. And then when I went to leave the company, my boss was like, well, I wish you would have just told me you wanted more flexibility, because we would have given that to you. And like, like you can still stick around and we'll give you that. But I was excited about my new role. So I ended up leaving. But the point is that I think sometimes addressing these things directly may result in answers that you're surprisingly happy with. And if you're not, maybe that is, something that you might want to leave. I'm not sure. I don't want to give like career advice here, but the idea is, I think the best piece of advice that from my perspective is addressing it directly, because at least that gives you the information you need about like, should you stick around, or is this where you want to be, for example. So anyway, all right. Thanks, Jackie. And Sounds like no one has any other questions, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you everyone for sticking around. If you stuck around for an hour and a half, this recording will go up online. As I mentioned, the DCR directory is available to anyone that has bought. Steve is asking quickly, are you planning to package DCR into any other formats, more bite-sized maybe? I don't know. I think maybe at some point, but at the moment, that's not really on the docket. I think that's one of the reasons that I created the videos originally, is just because I know that reading like a many 100-page word book is overwhelming. And so the videos are kind of like, if you can't do that, then like maybe watch these videos on 2x speed, and that is an alternative. But maybe in the future, if you think that's important, let me know and I'll consider it for sure. But I think the videos are meant to kind of be that. And then just as a reminder for DCR, it's not meant to be read entirely by everyone. It absolutely can be, but like I've realized the length of it can be prohibitive. So the idea is that I mentioned this at the beginning, but use it like a textbook, not a novel, which means that maybe you read certain sections to start, but then maybe you go and build whatever you're hoping to build. And then you realize, like I'm at the point where I need to like improve my bounce model. So maybe you go to the bounce model section and improve that. Or like, oh, I'm finally ready to like start addressing SEO. So maybe then you go read the SEO chapter. So it's not meant as much to be like, read this all in one go, because that would be too overwhelming. But I'll definitely consider to see if that's something that people want. Always open to feedback, but hopefully the videos for now will do the trick if you don't want to read the whole book. But yeah, that's it. All right, Steve saying, I have some thoughts on how we can do that. Yeah, if you want to be involved, like I said, Joao is one of the readers. He helped me compile that tool directory, which was really kind of him. So if you would like to help do that, like I would love the help. So anyway, feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on Twitter, or my email is hello@stephsmith.io. So yeah, I'm going to close it out here. Thank you so much for everyone that attended. And I'll try to organize these, maybe every quarter or every 6 months or something, if people have any new questions. Until then, feel free to ask any questions in the community. Okay, bye everyone. Thanks for coming.